Now, before we wrap up this week, I'd like to circle back to PropOrNot's naughty list and speak with supposed Russian propagandist and fake news peddler Mnar Muhawesh, journalist and founder of the alternative news site Mint Press News. Take a look. Let's talk about this new fake news issue, particularly with the Washington Post article that threw out some very well-respected alternative news sites as fake news, and meanwhile you have things like CNN and MSNBC and Fox News completely throwing fake news out every single day. Talk about this new craze to silence alternative media.
Well, I think what we're seeing is basically a re-emergence of Cold War rhetoric and this McCarthyist Red Scare. And what we're seeing actually, the day that Washington Post article came out with a list of fake news, supposed fake news websites, the EU actually passed this resolution to actually ban RT altogether from airing and broadcasting across Europe, even though RT makes up about like 0.1% of all European TV viewers, I believe it was. So it's a really, really small percentage. And they're accusing Russia of, dividing these democratic nations and spreading fear and propaganda. It's almost like they're projecting their own insecurities onto Russia. But they're using this Cold War rhetoric to justify censorship across the free world. I mean, if we think about the EU, all I can remember is like that free speech march across France after the Charlie Hebdo cartoon incident. And so, we have these supposedly, free speech havens like the EU and havens of the First Amendment and free speech here in the United States that criticize a lot of countries when they censor certain perspectives or political views. Yet we're right here in the United States getting blacklisted for doing our job and upholding the First Amendment. And, even though the Washington Post released this list, this is it's a scary time for alternative journalists and watchdog journalists, because now this is kind of setting up the stage for censoring, news websites. I'll give you an example of what we recently went through. One of our articles, no, not one of our articles, but an article that we had re-syndicated onto our website about Muslims marching against ISIS in Iraq went viral. Viral to the point where it made the Facebook trending. Yeah, trending topics. And we were getting about 100,000 or more unique visitors to our website every single day for about a week and a half for this one article. And what happened is that BuzzFeed, our favorite friends at BuzzFeed, they went after Mint Press for publishing this article and called it a fake news story, which, by the way, it's not fake. Muslims by the millions were marching in Iraq against ISIS. But what they did in this article, and they used the pretense of this Washington Post article of, this blacklist of fake news, is they said that Mint Press is part of the fake news blacklisted sites. And therefore, we need to be really careful about taking these stories seriously, because the only other website, according to BuzzFeed, that had published a story to show that Muslims by the millions were marching against ISIS for the Arba'in pilgrimage in Karbala in Iraq was RT. So this story must be Russian propaganda. And so it's these little things that the mainstream media is doing. And what BuzzFeed did was publish a fake news article right there in outing real news stories.
So, because it's an interesting time, because studies suggest that only 6% of the U.S. populace actually entirely trusts mainstream media, and yet they're lashing out at alternative media. So, do you see this as a time for alternative media to really take this stand, because you have this intense lashing out, sort of when mainstream media feels a bit cornered by U.S. By the paradigm, or how do you see this situation right now?
Well, it's clearly an old versus new, David versus Goliath kind of scenario. Since September 11th, we've seen a major consolidation of media. I mean, I remember because I wasn't really old enough then, but I remember studying that in the 1980s and in the 1990s, the media was owned by over 50 corporations, and by 2011, the media had now consolidated into being owned by just 6 corporations, and that number actually is continuing to decline into less corporate conglomerates owning the media. And so what happened was is people were getting the same kind of information. They were being fear-mongered to justify and to support the war on terror. And the economy in the United States was declining. And so what had happened is we start to see like this renaissance of independent and alternative media kind of erupt onto the surface to challenge this, corporate media giant that had taken over the sphere. And so with that, I think that alternative media, people are starting to turn more to it, and to get real news. And it's scaring the heck out of these old dinosaur media companies. We are seeing this rise of new, supposedly alternative media websites like Vice News, like BuzzFeed, like Vox News. They're being invested in from, the same people that own Fox News. Rupert Murdoch's name is all over them. They have old money going into those organizations. So they're obviously trying to still control the media, but they're still failing because they're still pushing Cold War rhetoric. They're still attacking basically anyone who's not white and Christian, I'm sorry to say. And they're spreading fear and division. And so more people, like you said, about 6%, only 6% of people in this country actually trust the media. So it's a very scary time for them. And so what they're trying to do is to make themselves relevant and say, hey guys, these alternative and watchdog journalists are fake, but we're the real news guys.
Yeah, and I remember you did a great piece on Vice News and about how they have a whole show that's dedicated, that's basically sponsored by Bank of America. So talk about the role of journalists in this, not just because of Trump's presidency and his own rhetoric cracking down on free speech and journalism, but the role of journalists now in separating themselves from, the Rupert Murdoch alternative media and focusing on this real push to get the truth out there.
Well, it's extremely challenging and it's extremely difficult because we are up against these billions and billions of dollars of funding that's basically going into the old media to push certain narratives. And so we as alternative journalists have to be creative in the way that we start our organizations and push our news stories out there. But, we've done a good job. I know you've done a good job in giving coverage of stories that the mainstream media is not covering. And I think that's really important, is looking at stories the mainstream media isn't covering and giving those stories attention. I mean, just look at what's happening at Standing Rock. If we look at coverage from NBC and the major news agencies, I mean, they are literally parroting the same narrative as the police and the governor in North Dakota by calling the water protectors rioters, violent. But we have Democracy Now!, we have Mint Press, we have other alternative media journalists on the ground giving live coverage of what's really going on and showing the dogs biting the protesters and how the police are the violent ones. They're the ones who are not upholding their oath to protect citizens from tyranny. And so it's really up to us to be creative. I actually just was in a journalism forum, and we talked about this very issue. And the part of the reason why a lot of the old media is afraid of the new media is because the new media is led by us, the millennials. And so, I'm under 30. I think you're under 30. And so okay, come on.
Just since yesterday, now I'm 30.
Well, happy 30th. And so, but for a long time, for the past 5 years, a lot of these new up and coming journalism organizations have been run by millennials who are sick and tired of the old media. They don't trust the old media anymore. And that's what's really scaring them.
So in particular about this idea of like the Christian and white, I know that obviously you've been covering this for years, and it seems like a lot of people feel that Islamophobia is like a new thing. So talk about, with your own experience, but also as a journalist, this experience of Islamophobia, and particularly this new idea of a Muslim registry that's come up since Trump won.
Well, I will never forget the day that my son, who's now 7 years old, he just turned 7, came home from school and he said, Mom, is it true that Donald Trump is going to put us all in jail and send us somewhere else, us Muslims? And so it's a really scary time for Muslims. And although what you said is correct, is that Islamophobia is not a new phenomenon. In fact, under President Obama, Islamophobia took a huge hike. we reached new levels of Islamophobia under the Obama administration. And most of that has to do with the expanding war machine. The United States is involved in over 134 acts of war in the Middle East and in Africa, in predominantly Muslim nations. And so they've basically crafted this narrative that it's like, we're overseas fighting this bad Muslim enemy. And while there are really bad people that we are fighting like ISIS and Al Qaeda, we're also at the same time arming them. The United States is actively arming those groups and fueling them. And so, to keep this very profitable war going, we have to continue to demonize the regular, everyday Muslims who are actually the biggest victim of these terrorist attacks in the Middle East and in Africa and across the world, actually. Although under Obama's presidency, Islamophobia reached new heights, he himself on his face that he was, defending Muslims. Like, for example, in this last year of his presidency, he went and visited a mosque to show solidarity with Muslims. But in the background, we have these 134 acts of war against Muslims in the Middle East, terrorizing Muslims, uprooting Muslims. We have one of the largest refugee crises that is affecting mostly Muslims, and so forth. But then here at home, this rhetoric to demonize Muslims has nothing to do with Muslims because it's used to justify Orwellian laws that allow the spying of everyday Americans, the spying of activists, and basically anybody who might criticize the government or growing government or the police state or the surveillance state. So now we have Donald Trump in his campaign, who he brought out, not all Donald Trump supporters are this way, but he did try to target a very specific audience, I guess you could say, of in American demographics that felt very disenfranchised. White, poor Americans that were insecure about their jobs. And they have every right to feel insecure about their jobs, but they needed somebody to blame it on. And so why not just blame it on Muslims like everybody else is blaming everything else on Muslims? And so with this rhetoric of registering Muslims, it's a very scary time for people like myself and people like my son and many of the Muslims across the country, because we are starting to live in fear again. Although Islamophobia has been an issue, it's kind of been swept under the rug, but now it's kind of resurfacing. We have, I've received on countless events online death threats, because obviously I'm out there as a journalist, and a lot of Muslim women are getting their hijab pulled off. We have more people bringing their racism out in the open and attacking Muslims for their faith. They're associating Al Qaeda, they're associating ISIS, the very groups our government is funding and arming, with everyday regular Muslims who are out there fighting against those terror groups and speaking up against these wars. And so it's a dangerous time, but I think this all goes back again to this, war on alternative perspectives and alternative views, and this reemergence of Cold War rhetoric. Islamophobia has been successfully used to justify an all-out Cold War against Russia, because now Russia is being accused with standing with the terrorists, I guess you could say, or our enemy states in the Middle East. And so it's all intertwined.
Yeah, and it's particularly for you because you are a Muslim journalist, and so you have the hate coming from the Islamophobia, but also coming from the fact that you are trying to put out real news that then gets branded as fake news because it doesn't align with the narrative that the government is pushing. So talk about sort of wrapping up here. I wanted to ask your opinion on what the best thing to do for people that aren't. I mean, is there a way to tell if something's really fake news or not, outside of the fact that it's on Fox News or something? And also, how can we that aren't Muslim or people of color, how can we best combat the government narrative?
I want to answer that question first because somebody actually messaged me and they said, I don't agree with Islam and I don't agree that you wear a hijab, but I really think you're one of the best journalists out there. And I thought, he's really trying hard not to, disrespect my faith and the fact that I, choose, to wear a head covering. But I really, was happy to hear that he felt that about our news. So it's definitely a challenge and a balancing act. And so what we have even within the progressive community and even within, the libertarian community is even we are being affected by these carefully crafted narratives about Muslims. I mean, I don't know how often, even from my own friends, I hear them kind of subtly making comments that, oh, well, Islam oppresses women. Or, I made a comment that my family lives in Palestine. Oh, how are the women treated there? So we really have to be careful and, being able to separate these kinds of things. Does oppression of women exist in the Muslim world? Yes, of course. It exists right here, too. We have one of the highest rates of, sexual assault and rape of women here in the United States, but we don't blame that on Christianity or whatever. Issues of abuse and oppression exist all over the world. I mean, we have our government literally oppressing entire nations through banking cartels and wars. And so even within our own watchdog, progressive leftist movement, we have to be careful in parroting those narratives and educate ourselves about what the real Islam is, or what head covering is. And again, I'm just using those as examples. And when it comes to fake news, we have to remember that this isn't really about blacklisting news or censoring news. We have an issue with media literacy in this country. I just did an interview with Mickey Huff, who's the director of Project Censored, and he spoke to me about this very subject. He said, this is not about making a list. He's like, that's the worst thing you can do. The problem is we as Americans are not equipped with the correct information about what is real news and what's not, real news. And it's because we are getting our news from the so-called fake news outlets, which are the corporate media. And so we have to educate ourselves and re-empower ourselves and put the power back in our hands, through education, through research, and through reading, because that's the only thing that we have against the growing state who's trying to silence alternative perspectives, is we have to re-empower ourselves with pertinent information. And that's the only thing that we can do.
And do you see, finally, do you see that happening mostly online or mostly in the streets? I mean, education is such a hard issue, particularly in this country where education has been getting slammed for decades. And, you have kids growing up that don't even know who we won independence from. So this idea of education is really tricky. Do you see that happening in terms of building social justice movements in the streets or online, or both?
It is actually both. I mean, today we have 6 corporations that control over 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read. So it's very hard to break through the media monster that we have surrounding us. I mean, it's getting us from every direction, from the magazines in the grocery store, from the radio, from the little ads that pop up on YouTube, from, even online, we're bombarded with these corporate media narratives. But yes, you're absolutely right. It has to start from a grassroots movement. We have to break away from the chains of the corporate media, and we have to start our own movements and really question even our own beliefs. I think that's where it really starts, is question our own beliefs and have a paradigm shift, a revolution within our own consciousness about what really is the truth. If a message is teaching us to hate somebody else, then we should really question what's really behind the story. Or if it's teaching us to demonize other people that we have never met, we have to really question the motivation of these stories. And we have to get off of our butts, get off of, our TVs and our phones even. I know we're all glued to our phones. We need to get off of our phones, and we have to get on the street and meet other people. As a Muslim woman, American woman, I love to go and, join interfaith groups, because I want to learn about other people's faiths and what unites us. If we're going to sit here and focus so much on our differences, we're just going to, we're going to get distracted. But if we focus on our, what brings us all together and what unites us, that's how we build peaceful efforts. Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, which is security, good health and happiness, and not people at the very top oppressing us.